Affect positive change, dig it, universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. 2 G's per month, the work we running. Bottom up economics, get the money coming. Now dig, time to change the economic system. No more poor and middle class victims. Poor and middle class pockets getting fatter. Money for the least of these is what matters. Bottom up economics is where it begins. Rich folks get profit on the back end. The poor and middle class spend the money. The spent money stimulates the economy. Everyone benefits from bottom to top. With poor and middle class, cash money drops. We talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. Corrupt corporations. What's up, everybody?
Welcome to BGMG Radio with Byron Goines and Meshelle Goines.
Let's get into today's lecture entitled The Federal Reserve, Federal Government, Deficit and Surplus, 1971 through 2020. The subtitle of today's lecture is Historical Facts to Support Universal Basic Income. Now let's get started. First, let's look at the historical data in Figure 1 from the Congressional Budget Office, which covers revenues, outlays, deficits, surpluses, and debt held by the public since 1962 in billions of dollars. We'll start with the year 1971, which was the year the Nixon administration suspended the gold standard. This resulted in fiat money, which is money that is made to be legal tender by the government, even though it has no gold backing it. Or in other words, money created out of thin air. There is also another side of money creation out of thin air, whereby the Federal Reserve, through computer keystrokes, creates money out of thin air to purchase securities to add liquidity to the banking system and loan money to the United States federal government, which is placed into the government's operating cash account at the Federal Reserve. Money is loaned to the United States federal government by the Federal Reserve to cover the deficit. In this lecture, we're going to cover the deficit, the Federal Reserve, and some other important information. Next, look at the total column. The total column data clearly shows there were deficits, or in other words, a negative balance, each fiscal year from 1971 until 1998. In 1998, there was a surplus, or in other words, a positive balance each fiscal year for 4 years, from 1998 to 2001. From 2002 until 2020, there were deficits, or in other words, a negative balance each fiscal year. Out of 49 years, the United States federal government operated 45 fiscal years at a deficit, or in other words, a negative balance for 45 fiscal years. And the United States federal government operated at a surplus, or in other words, a positive balance, only 4 fiscal years. Now, how did the United States federal government do this and keep the economy rolling? The Federal Reserve System has been utilized to cover deficits as needed. And as the Federal Reserve System has been utilized to benefit the rich as a result of massive tax cuts favoring the rich, which cut tax revenue and added to the deficit as a result, and as the Federal Reserve System has been utilized to add liquidity to the banking system, which benefits the banks and leaves the poor and middle class in debt, then the Federal Reserve System can be utilized to benefit the poor and middle class through funding $2,000 in United States monthly government guaranteed universal basic income for poor and middle class citizens at least 18 years of age. According to USA.gov, the deficit is financed by the sale of Treasury securities, bonds, notes, and bills, which the government pays back with interest. Part of what the government spends money on each year is the interest owed on all years' deficits combined, or the national debt. Now, this was from USA.gov. One of the ways the deficit is financed is listed at datalab.usaspending.gov, and reads as follows. The government can also use operating cash, which is available from an account at the Federal Reserve, to pay for deficit spending. This would be similar to an individual using their debit card to pay for purchases. Now, where does the Federal Reserve get its money to purchase securities so the government can cover the deficit with operating cash? The Federal Reserve does not use tax money for the purchase. In fact, the tax money has already been spent, which is the reason for the deficit years. The Federal Reserve, through typing whatever amount it's in need of through some keystrokes, creates the money it needs to purchase the securities so the government can cover the deficit through an operating cash loan. Remember, the money is created through computer keystrokes as a credit, with the money coming from nowhere to fund the credit. In a normal transaction, money has to come from somewhere to fund any credits. But not in the case of the Federal Reserve System purchases of securities to add liquidity to the banking system and or lend money to the United States federal government. You dig? Cool. Now let's move on. Now the money is created out of thin air, and this is confirmed by the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, as Ben Bernanke confirmed these facts in a 60 Minutes interview. Now listen to the following audio clip from the television show 60 Minutes, posted to YouTube by CBS, and listen to former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke as he confirms Federal Reserve money creation out of thin air.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
These are the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke telling everyone how the Federal Reserve creates money by using computer keystrokes to mark up the size of the account that the bank has with the Fed. The money is not coming from a Federal Reserve account that has money in it to draw from to pay for the securities purchase as in a normal transaction. The Federal Reserve has $0 to draw from. The Federal Reserve has no money to begin with, but still has the ability to purchase securities by marking up the size of the accounts banks have with the Fed without having any money to cover the markup. You dig? The next audio clip will show how this is done. The Federal Reserve owned approximately $800 billion in securities at the beginning of the financial crisis, and in this audio clip, Ben Bernanke stated that the Federal Reserve purchased $2 trillion of additional securities. Now, how did the Federal Reserve purchase $800 billion of securities with no money, and later purchase $2 trillion additional dollars in securities? The Federal Reserve had no money. The Federal Reserve had $0 to purchase the $800 billion of securities that were on their balance sheet, and the Federal Reserve had $0 to purchase $2 trillion additional dollars of securities. The Federal Reserve had no money. This second audio clip will explain it in more detail. Now remember what Ben Bernanke stated in the first audio clip.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
In this second audio clip, Ben Bernanke also confirms Federal Reserve System money creation out of thin air in a 2012 college lecture posted on YouTube by the Federal Reserve. Now listen to this second audio clip.
Now, you might ask the question, well, the Fed's going out and buying $2 trillion of securities. How do we pay for that? And the answer is that we paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us. And those accounts at the banks showed up as reserves that the banks would hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. Banks can hold deposit accounts with the Fed, essentially, and those are called reserve accounts. And so as the purchases of securities occurred, the way we paid for them was basically by increasing the amount of reserves that banks had in their accounts with the Fed. So you can see this here. This is the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. Of course, assets and liabilities, including capital, have to be equal. So the liability side had also to rise near $3 trillion, as you can see.
Now, as Ben Bernanke stated in this second audio clip, the Federal Reserve marked up the deposit accounts that the banks have with the Federal Reserve. And the reserve account is the same thing as a deposit account. And the Federal Reserve used the balance sheet to show a credit of money to the bank accounts of the securities dealers. No money was deducted from a Federal Reserve account to pay the securities dealers for the purchases, as in the case of a normal transaction. The Federal Reserve had no money. The Federal Reserve had $0, so there was nowhere to draw money from to pay the securities dealers for the purchases, as in the case of a normal transaction. The Federal Reserve had $800 billion of securities on their balance sheet before they increased the amount through computer keystrokes to approximately $3 trillion of securities, which includes both the $800 billion of securities and the $2 trillion of securities. The Federal Reserve increased their asset side of their balance sheet to approximately $3 trillion, and they increased their liability side of their balance sheet to approximately $3 trillion, which made both sides of the balance sheet equal and showed a money transaction when there was no money coming from a Federal Reserve account to pay for the securities purchase, as in the case of a normal transaction. You dig? This is how the Federal Reserve System creates money out of thin air, and you now know how it's done. Now, we dig the fact that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air because there should be no poverty in the United States if the Federal Reserve money creation system was used properly. But what we don't dig is how the Federal Reserve money creation system is currently being used. Now let's look at how it can be used in a better way to address poverty in the United States. As shown in the information I've presented here, the Federal Reserve adds liquidity to the banking system through creating money out of thin air through computer keystrokes into an account that the bank has with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve uses this same method to purchase securities so the government can cover the deficit with operating cash. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air through computer keystrokes into an account that the government has with the Federal Reserve. Because of the fact that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air through computer keystrokes, there does not have to be any yearly deficits or national debt. You dig? The money is created from nothing. The money is created out of thin air. And since the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air through computer keystrokes and place it in the system as a credit into an account that the government has with the Federal Reserve so the government can cover the deficit with an operating cash loan, then the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air through computer keystrokes and place it in the system as a credit into the operating cash account that the government has with the Federal Reserve to cover $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income for poor and middle class United States citizens 18 years of age or older, which can then be released by the United States Department of the Treasury and disbursed to the people. You dig? And it does not have to add to the deficit, because the Federal Reserve will not be lending this created money to the government. The Federal Reserve will be giving this created money to the government. The Federal Reserve will be creating the money out of thin air through computer keystrokes to address poverty in the United States in the way that it should be addressed. This Federal Reserve money creation through computer keystrokes, money coming from nowhere out of thin air to spur economic growth through bank system, and this Federal Reserve money creation through computer keystrokes, money coming from nowhere out of thin air to loan to the United States government so it can cover the deficit with operating cash system, can be utilized to fund $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income for every poor and middle class United States citizen 18 years of age or older, which will stimulate the economy and go a long way towards ending poverty in the United States and eliminate any need for taxpayer dollars to fund this program. In conclusion, now during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve has been creating $120 billion per month out of thin air to purchase securities to spur economic growth. Economic stimulus money that the United States federal government has been disbursing to the states has undoubtedly come from a Federal Reserve System operating cash loan. And it's time for the United States federal government to change up the economic system, as Congress can amend the Federal Reserve Act as it sees fit. The United States federal government should immediately begin paying $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income to every poor and middle class United States citizen 18 years of age or older through Federal Reserve System created money. And the United States federal government should pay off the national debt through Federal Reserve System created money. Now, if today's lecture has been a blessing to you, visit us online at BGMGradio.com and make a donation to help us do what we do. Today's lecture will be made available at BGMGradio.com in the lecture section and the ebook section. Click Shop and click Lectures and Sermons. We thank you for your time. Did you dig today's broadcast? Contact us at BGMGradio.com and let us know. If you're listening on YouTube, click subscribe so you can be notified about new uploads.
Thank you for listening to BGMG Radio with Byron Goines and Meshelle Goines.
To effect positive change, dig it. Universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. 2 G's per month, the work we running. Bottom up economics, get the money coming. Now dig, time to change the economic system. No more poor and middle class victims. Poor and middle class pockets getting fatter. Money for the least of these is what matters. Bottom up economics is where it begins. Rich folks get profit on the back end. The poor and middle class spend the money. The spent money stimulates the economy. Everyone benefits from bottom to top when poor and middle class cash money drops. We talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. Corrupt